Welcome to The Point. And this is number 4 of a series of 4 programs on the end times with a very close friend of mine, Derek Walker. Derek Walker of Oxford Bible Church. Derek, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
And Derek's been talking for the last 3 programs, and this is his concluding program on the imminent invasion of Israel. I'll say it again, the imminent invasion of Israel as discussed in Ezekiel 38. Now, we have to ask Derek a question. We are in end times. We've been talking about the rapture. We've been talking about the parable of the fig tree. And Derek has taught me, and I believe everything that Derek's been teaching me over these many, many years since I've known him, that there is something really important on the prophetic timescale. So, Derek, over to you to tell us about the imminent invasion of Israel.
Well, yes, there is a major prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and half of Ezekiel 39, which says it will happen in the latter days when Israel is regathered from the nations, which is the time we live in since 1948. And yet it is not Armageddon right at the end, because it says after this battle, after this war, there will be a 7-year clear-up operation. So it's going to happen quite possibly before the rapture, or maybe just after, but nevertheless, it's the next major event. This is a major divine intervention,
right,
on a massive scale, bigger almost than anything that's ever happened before, but not the Battle of Armageddon.
Hang on, summary time. Right at the beginning of the program, Derek says something really, really world-shattering is about to happen. The imminent invasion of Israel as discussed in the book of Revelation, as discussed in Ezekiel 38, and this is almost certainly going to happen before the rapture. Is that right, Derek?
Well, we don't know, because the rapture is imminent. It could happen just after the rapture, but my money would be on it happening, being the next major event that's going to happen.
Right.
Because it actually triggers a worldwide revival that we'll see. So it's a very important event, and it may well be that it triggers the final revival of the church age. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. And I've already written a book on this called The Imminent Invasion of Israel, and which people can get from my website. But since writing the book, I've also, there's nothing in the book I would take back, but I've seen some new insights that are relevant to this, that really bring it up to date, so which I'd love to show, today. But if we look at the actual prophecy just for a few minutes in Ezekiel 38, it's a prophecy of a tremendous invasion of Israel. And we're going to see a picture in a minute of the invading nations. And he says, "Set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshesh, and Tubal, and prophesy against him." And then it describes, and he says, God is actually going to put a hook in his jaw and bring him down on the nation of Israel. And there will be this massive invading army. And it says, it describes the invading nations, and the picture we show now shows the different names, and we can actually locate where they are. Notice, in the prophecy, it talks about from the far north. The leader of this invasion comes from the far north. Far north of Israel is actually Russia. That's where Magog there is. But also Turkey is heavily emphasized. Also Persia or Iran is heavily emphasized, as well as some North African countries like Sudan and Libya. And they are also part of it. And he says many other nations too. So it's like an international coalition force. And it seems like most nations are involved, except it talks about Tarshish and her young lions, and it talks about Sheba and Dedan opposing this invasion. But it's like an international invasion force. But God is actually going to use this invasion to bring judgment on those nations and to glorify himself as the God of Israel and the God of the Bible. And as I say, God will be glorified as a result of this, because God isn't going to let Israel deal with it, or America, or anyone else for that matter. God himself is going to intervene. And the whole world will know it, because it's going to be a supernatural event, a supernatural deliverance. And so it's going to be dramatic when it happens. And it will give us an opportunity to witness, because we'll be able to say, look, it's here in the Bible all the time in great detail, and now it's happened. How can you deny the Bible It's true. And so it says, in the latter years, in verse 8, in the latter days, you'll come into the land, those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel. So we're going to emphasize this later, that the location of the invasion is actually the mountains of Israel. And there's a picture of Israel, a 3D picture, which shows the mountains. It's where Shechem and Jerusalem, and it's the mountains of Israel is actually the heartland of Israel. Then to the further over is the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea and the lowlands, but the mountains is the heartland of Israel, where most of the biblical action took place. And we'll talk about the mountains in a bit. And it says, they've long been desolate. They've been brought out from the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. And notice they dwell safely, they dwell securely. And then it says, this person, verse 11, it's talking about the leader of Russia. He says, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. We want to talk about what that means. I will go to a peaceful people. So these people don't want war. And that's true about Israel. And they dwell safely. They feel secure. And certainly under the presidency right now, they feel protected. America's very much for them. So it fits the present situation. The invading nations fit the present situation. In Turkey, Iran, Russia, we can see that happening. In fact, even in Syria, we can see how that's happening, because all three nations are in Syria now, which border on Israel. So you can see how it would be easy for those nations now to come in through Syria and invade Israel. It's as if the whole scene has been set. And it says that the reason for this conquest, in Russia's mind, is economic and strategic and for power, because it will give Russia the foothold, the control of the Middle East, the control of the oil and the gas, which Israel has come into a lot of that, and a strategic hold on the whole Middle East. So Russia will have selfish motives, but she'll pretend to have honorable motives, as we'll see. But there are some nations, it says in verse 13, yes, it says, who dwell in the midst of the land. These people dwell in the midst of the land. That could mean dwell in the midst of the earth. In other words, the strategic location. And Sheba, Sheba, Dedan, that's really Saudi Arabia, and the merchants of Tarshish. We want to talk about who they are. And all their young lions. They are the ones who will oppose Russia. And they say, have you come to take plunder? Have you come to take booty? In other words, they're calling them out. They're saying, you're not, Russia will be pretending to do it for altruistic reasons, which we'll talk about. But actually they're saying, no, you're really doing it to get control of the Middle East, to get control of the oil and the gas. And then God's response, it says, thus says the Lord God in verse 14, on that day when my people Israel dwell safely. Notice, even though Israel is not in faith right now and has been disciplined by God, yet God still calls them my people. They're his covenant people. Later on, he says, how dare you invade my land? This land belongs to God. You have no right to try and control it. And God's going to judge all nations who try and take control of Jerusalem and of the land of Israel. And this will be a classic example of that. He says, you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. In the latter days, I will bring you against my land, God's land, that the nations may know me when I'm hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. So God's going to step in, it won't be the defense forces of Israel. God himself is going to demonstrate his glory by judging this invading army. It's going to be amazing on the news, I tell you. It says God's going to get angry. My fury will show in my face when Gog comes against my land, Israel. And then he describes, we won't go through it all, but earthquakes break out, the invading armies fight each other, basically all kinds of diseases break out among the army. There's all kinds of, hail from heaven, you name it, huge earthquake. And this whole invading army is destroyed.
Wow.
Totally. And there is fire in Magog and the other land. So God isn't normally judging at this time, but he really will move in judgment. And the nations will be stunned, because suddenly they will realize the God of the Bible is still alive. The God of Israel is still alive. And it says that God will be glorified among the nations. This will be a chance for a worldwide revival that's going to come out of this. In chapter 39, again, he emphasizes in verse 2 that he brings them from the far north. That's why we know it will be led by Russia. The Islamic nations, of course, would love to destroy Israel, but they know that they would need a nation like Russia to lead the way.
I believe Moscow is due north of
Jerusalem. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again he says, against the mountains of Israel. He says that again and again, the mountains of Israel. And then in verse 7 he says, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. And so it will bring revival to Israel. And then it says, then the nations will know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. In other words, I live in Israel. The nations will know, so it'll be a revival. And then he says in verse 9 that they will be burning the weapons of this army for 7 years. So it's got to be at least 7 years before the final end. Yeah. And so how does this relate? Now I want to move on really to the kind of special insights that I've received recently that I believe.
Well, before you do, let's just summarise what you've already said, which is so important. Thank you, Derek. Just absolutely wonderful to have you here, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us. But anyway, only the Bible knows, only God knows the future, and He's actually given us in Ezekiel 38 the next major war. I'm not talking about the Battle of Armageddon, I'm talking about the invasion of Israel, which is going to be a world-shattering event because this massive army from Russia and Iran and Iraq and Turkey and all these other nations are going to be destroyed. They're going to be completely destroyed, and it's going to be, God's going to do it. It's not going to happen actually in Israel. It's going to happen before they actually invade Israel. It's going to be a world-shattering event. It's going to stun everybody. And this is the next thing, because you remember we started off this series of 4 programs that all of this is going to happen within a lifetime of 1948. Well, members of my family were born in 1948, and we're just coming up to the 70th birthday of the rebirth of Israel, May the 14th, 1948. So we don't know exactly when this is all going to happen, but it's the next major event on planet Earth, is what Derek's talking about. Another thing that I learned many, many years ago, and I don't know if I'm up to date, but when it says that they'll be burning the weapons of war for 7 years, I understood when I first read about it that the weapons of war nowadays made out of lignocaine, which burns. I don't know if it still applies, but that's what I learnt many years ago. Have you heard of that before?
Vaguely.
Something called lignocaine. Anyway, there we are. Back to you. World-shattering events.
Yeah, and just to be clear, these armies will invade the mountains of Israel. That's what I want to talk about next. And God destroys those armies, not necessarily the nations, although there are signs that judgment will fall on the nations itself. Right. But we're not saying that those nations will be destroyed, but those armies that invade Israel will be destroyed. But one of the new insights I saw was that it's an invasion of the mountains of Israel. Now, we're going to see some pictures now that kind of explain what that is. What is the mountains of Israel? And is that different from Israel, per se? Yeah. And the mountains of Israel, and we're going to see that in this picture, is not the whole of Israel. You can see the mountains of Israel marked out here, and it's the heartland of Israel. It's the Judea Samaria would be the biblical description. It's where Shechem is. It's where Jerusalem is on the edge of it. Hebron. These is on the high ground of Israel, the mountains of Israel. And that's exactly what is called the occupied, I don't like to use this terminology, but it's the occupied territories. It's before 1967, this was occupied by Jordan, and then Israel won that back. These are the occupied territories, the disputed territories, the West Bank, it's called as well. And that's the nations in the UN even made a resolution saying that doesn't belong to Israel, that belongs to the Palestinian state. And notice they doesn't say it's the invasion of Israel proper, because Israel has nuclear weapons. I don't think they would do that. But what they might do and not be resisted if Russia could do it by itself, but by putting together an international force, like America did for Iraq, it gives it legitimacy.
Yeah.
And so they will do this international force to enforce, they'll say that we're enforcing the UN resolutions.
Sure.
We are just, Israel won't listen, so we're going to make it happen, and we're going to force the Palestinian state into existence. And Israel won't be able to fight back because, you know, it's still these disputed territories. They're not going to attack Israel itself, but the mountains of Israel. But Russia will have her real motive is that will give her great power in the Middle East and control of the oil and the gas. That will be her real motive. The Tarshish nations come against it, but all they say is words, because they don't have time to do anything, because actually God's going to step in and deal with it.
Yeah.
Israel herself could not possibly hope to oppose Russia in that. Of course, if Israel herself were attacked, Israel would, of course, do what she could to fight for her survival. But it's not Israel itself, it's the mountains of Israel. And so Israel won't be able to really do anything about it. It will seem like that they've taken the mountains, but then God steps in and destroys those mountains. So it's important to understand the mountains. And the mountains of Israel, God says, is my land. Because in another diagram that we have, it actually shows that all the times where God spoke to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and promised them the land, it was on the mountains of Israel. It's either Shechem or Jerusalem or Hebron. That's the mountains of Israel. So these mountains are not some side piece of land that doesn't really matter. It's the heartland of Israel. And that's the very contested land that all the nations of the world are contesting and saying Israel. They're trying to divide the land and take it from Israel. But God has covenanted it to Israel, so God's going to take that very seriously. And of course, at the moment, we see that America is really the only nation that's standing on Israel's side. Generally, the UN nations are very much against Israel having that land.
True.
So this brings another interesting line, that it says that Israel is dwelling securely under the present presidency.
And that's important.
It's true, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's really
so
important.
That lines up.
President Trump.
President Trump's, they dwell, in fact, they're increasing the settlements. See, the real issue is settlements. You'll see that in the news. The settlements. And Israel now has got more confidence with Trump, and so they are building more settlements. That's going to become more and more the issue. And Russia, at some point, will seize her opportunity. Maybe when the Syrian situation is dealt with, I don't know, but Russia will take her opportunity there. But another interesting phrase is the land of unwalled villages. And this really puzzled me because, in a sense, in the prophecy of the end times, it's, every country, no city has walls because they're pointless. So it's saying something more. And in the times of the Bible, you would have a city that had walls. And then you would have the land surrounding it of villages. And those villages were called the daughters of the main city. So that you have the daughters of Jerusalem are the villages and the towns surrounding Jerusalem. When they come under attack, they would pay taxes to the main city. When they were under attack, the daughters would flee for refuge within the walls of the main city.
Yeah, that makes
That's
sense.
how it worked. So the land of unwalled villages is the area surrounding the fortified hub. So the parallel thing now in the prophecy is that Israel proper is the walled city. It's protected. But the area that we call the mountains of Israel, the area where the settlements are, is not part of Israel proper. It's like the land of unwalled villages. So what's going to happen when this invading army comes in? Of course, all the people in the settlements, they're going to flee into Israel, inside the walls of Israel. And then the army will then take over the mountains of Israel, these invading armies. Then God is going to heap these judgments on the mountains of Israel where the armies are. So the Jews there, they will be safe from those judgments. See, if they invaded Israel itself, and when God poured out these judgments, then of course all the Jews would get destroyed along with the armies. So see what he does. They run to protection within the walls, and then we can see the whole scenario fitting together well. And then God will then judge those armies on the mountains of Israel, and God will vindicate his name, and God will say, actually, the Bible's true. I am the God of Israel, and it's my land, and you trying to take the land, I'm going to show my hand. And as a result, there'll be a great turning to God, a great turning to the Bible, and it will be our best opportunity, really, to preach the gospel. And the other interesting thing is, of course, that encourages us, is that it's Tarshish that actually stands against Russia.
Right.
So who is Tarshish? Because this is very interesting for us, because I believe that Tarshish is actually the United Kingdom.
Right.
It's not just Tarshish, of course.
Are you listening, everybody? It's getting even more interesting now, because Tarshish is the United Kingdom. Carry on, Derek.
Yeah, and I want to prove that. Actually, it's Tarshish and her young lions. And it's interesting that out of the United Kingdom, right, when we were great, as it were, are many young lions. Many nations come out of the United Kingdom, such as USA. And we could talk about the Commonwealth nations. And it's interesting, in the 2 world wars, it was the Tarshish nations that stood against the spirit of evil, trying to take over the world. And in this war also, it seems. So at the very least, Tarshish, God wouldn't mention Tarshish unless she played an important role in this. Because although it is God moving to defend Israel, God works through people. And I think it's the Tarshish nations. I believe there's going to be a revival in the Tarshish nations. And there's going to be a rising up, and we will be part of, even if it's just in prayer. We will be, as it were, instruments through which God can move to move in this situation, because God highlights the Tarshish nations as taking a stand against that, and God's going to honor that. So that gives us hope for a revival in this nation, I believe. Now, why is the UK Tarshish? Because it says the merchants of Tarshish and all their young lions. So it talks about Tarshish and younger nations that in some way come out of Tarshish. And it says the merchants of Tarshish, because we've always been a trading nation, of course. Now, why? We hear about Tarshish with Jonah, for example. Jonah wanted to get away from God, from the presence of God, which is in Israel, it says, and he fled to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So in other words, you go as far west as possible. Tarshish was as far west as possible, away from the presence of the Lord. Well, that takes you to the United Kingdom. I mean, not to America, because they didn't go so far in those days. That's one clue, but the major clue, who Tarshish, because some people say it's Spain. But Ezekiel 27:12 says, Tarshish was your merchant because of your many luxury goods. They gave you silver, iron, tin.
Tin.
And lead for your goods. Now, there was only one nation that traded tin. Spain doesn't have the tin. We were known one time as the Tin Islands.
Oh, right.
So this tells us Tarshish has to be the United Kingdom.
Or from Cornwall, I imagine.
A lot of it there from Cornwall. So the Tarshish is the United Kingdom. Right. That gives us great hopes. Because also, if you look at the prophecies of the millennium, in the future 1,000-year reign of Christ, Tarshish is a blessed nation in the millennium. She's mentioned a few times that the kings of Tarshish offer gifts and use the transportation. So there's a blessing on Tarshish. That means that Tarshish will be a nation that has supported Israel, that has been used by God, and this invasion is one of those cases. So I believe God has a call and destiny on this nation to preach the gospel, to support Israel. In fact, it's because we had the anointing to help establish Israel. We forsook Israel to some degree, and that brought us under judgment. That brought us under, we lost our sovereignty, not only over our empire, but also over ourselves, because we come under the EU, but I won't go there. But now God is actually raising up Tarshish again. We have a call and a destiny from God to preach the gospel and to play a role. And the fact that we are mentioned in this prophecy on the right side shows that God's anointing, I believe, is coming back on this land. And we have a role to play in the end time scenario. And I believe the revival that is coming will be strong in this nation. And God's going to use this nation, not just this nation, but we will be a key base for this revival.
Well, that's what Revelation TV is all about.
Yes.
Jesus is going to all the world, preach the gospel, and that's why you're here, to tell us what's going to happen in the nation of Tarshish, which is the United Kingdom, towards the end of time. Derek, we've only got two and a half minutes left. So can you tell us about how people get hold of your teaching on your excellent website, oxfordbiblechurch.co.uk?
Yes, we can. This book, the book called The Imminent Invasion of Israel, is my book on this. And you can get that from our website, oxfordbiblechurch.co.uk. There's some YouTube videos I've put up, actually, which is our program that shows at Revelation. A couple of years later, I put them on YouTube. And there's a series that go into what we've been talking about called Prophetic Insights for the Last Days, something like that. If I've piqued your interest a little bit, you can find out more there. But basically, we're living in exciting times, and we need to be spiritually ready for the revival that's coming. I believe, for when this happens, it's going to cause a shockwave through the earth. God's going to make Himself very evident, but it won't cause people to be saved. People have to hear the gospel to be saved, but we must be ready to share the gospel when this happens, because there'll be a window of opportunity that might last for 6 months or something to really get the gospel to people.
Wonderful. Well, Derek's been talking about the imminent invasion of Israel, which is really imminent because it's 70 years on May the 14th, coming up this year, 2018, 70 years since the rebirth of Israel on May the 14th, 1948. And Jesus said in Matthew 24 that everything in Matthew 24 would happen within the lifetime of anybody born in 1948. So we haven't got much longer, and this is going to happen very soon. So do get write to info@Revelation TV if you've got any comments. I've actually believed in this stuff so strongly. I have my own rapture will, and if you want to know about that, go to info@Revelation TV and ask me a question. And Derek, just finish off the program by telling us how we should be living in these end times. Just got 30 seconds.
Well, Jesus said, get into my word.
Yeah.
We need to be faithful to Jesus. We need to be serious to follow Him. We can't do it on our own. We need to be part of a fellowship of believers. We need to be strong in the Word of God. We need to pray, obviously. We need to be serious of following the Lord with all our heart. And in that day, He'll be able to say, well done, good and faithful servant.
Well, that's wonderful, Derek. And thank you so much for joining us. To the Point every week at 8:30. Thank you for joining us, and see you again next week.